The papacy came alive again about the year 1000 with great popes like Gregory VII and Innocent III. The dream of these popes was to create a Christendom. Granted, they did so through political means, by gaining political control. But they had a vision, and that vision was a society that was under Christ. These men were the products of a reform movement, the Cluny Reform movement. And there appears to be, though we cannot judge people's hearts, but there appears to be a very sincere motive in these people. Though we today, sitting back and sitting in judgment perhaps on what took place 1,000 years ago, might say their methodology was flawed, and we have a better methodology. However, our judgment might fall on this matter. Let's try to see what really happened and to try to understand at least both sides of this situation. And I say both sides because when these popes made the claim to being the head of a united Christendom, they were in fact making a claim to sovereignty. Not the sovereignty of God, but the sovereignty of man, to be a sovereign leader, a sovereign ruler over Christendom in the name of God. Now that would be challenged. The kings of Europe, as they came to power, would to some degree challenge that, particularly the kings of England, where the English developed along very different lines. But the great struggle, the titanic struggle, the struggle to the death, was with the German Empire. And what we say tonight has very important ramifications, not only for the history of the church, but also for an understanding of what has happened in our own day as we try to come to terms with World War I and World War II. That isn't specifically the history of the church, but we can't isolate these events out and say, here's the secular, here's the sacred. They all are intertwined and interrelated. Now, the concept of empire began with Augustus, the first Caesar of Rome, the first emperor of Rome. That concept of empire was certainly inherited by the popes. And building upon the model of Augustus, they saw themselves as the head of not a secular empire such as Rome was, but of a Christian empire. And they picked up that vision to a large degree from St. Augustine's City of God, in which he said there are two cities, a city of man and a city of God. And God is creating his great city. The city of man is the foreshadowing, as the Old Testament and the Old Testament rituals foreshadowed the New Testament, which was more spiritual, heavenly, if you please. As the writer of Hebrews says, here we have the Roman Empire foreshadowing the Christian Empire. And so it really goes back to Augustus and to the Roman Empire. When the Roman Empire fell, collapsed in the West in the 5th century A.D., the Christians interpreted that event as God at work. As a matter of fact, St. Augustine wrote the City of God shortly before that took place, after the sacking of Rome in 410. And therefore, Christian interpretation was God is simply removing the city of man to replace it with the city of God. Now, it took a long while before there would actually be an empire in the West of a political nature to challenge the concept of a spiritual empire. And so for many years, as we see the papacy developing, as we see the church developing, there was no empire, no political empire, to step in and try to say, we should be the sovereign, we should be the ruler, rather than the church. Now in the East, the Eastern Roman Empire continued in Constantinople, continued unabated until 1453. But in the West, no political unity, and therefore no real challenge to the concept of the city of God, until Charlemagne. In 800, Charlemagne, who was the king of France, whose father was the first of the Carolingian kings of France, Charlemagne was coronated as the emperor of the Roman Empire. And the idea now was revived by Charlemagne that the empire was reborn in the West, and he was the emperor. Now Charlemagne was the friend of the church. He did not try to oppose the church, and so somehow this slipped by without much real conflict. The Carolingians then began to lose power, and by the year 900, Carolingian empire was a memory. As a matter of fact, the Carolingian Empire, the Empire of Charlemagne, had split into three parts in 843. A French-speaking part, a German-speaking part, and a middle kingdom, which is known as Burgundy, or you may know it as Alsace-Lorraine, because you know that both Germany and France have fought over that territory many times, with the main city being Strasbourg. Eventually, the Carolingian king in the German-speaking lands lost power and was replaced by another dynasty. Now, in Germany, these monarchs were elected. And so there was an election in 919 of a man named Henry the Fowler. He's called Henry the Fowler because his name was Henry and he was out hunting at the time. He was the Duke of Saxony. And he is the beginning of what's known as the Ottonian dynasty. He has a son named Otto. Otto defeated the Magyars in 955. The Magyars were invaders of Central Europe, marauders, pillaging and looting and burning, and he defeated them in 955 at the Battle of Lech. The Magyars then settled down to become the nation of Hungary, their capital at Budapest. Otto thought that this was sufficient sign from God of his greatness, and therefore, in the year 962, Otto declared himself emperor. Now, once again, we have an empire in the West, but this time it is a German empire. German speaking all the way. Charlemagne's empire encompassed both France and Germany. This is just in the German-speaking lands. And that idea caught on of a German empire. At this point, the papacy was concerned about this German empire because the German emperors were making all kinds of claims. For instance, they were saying, we have the right to appoint popes. We have the right to appoint bishops. But the papacy was very weak. The papacy had been controlled by a senatorial family in Rome since the time of the great Pope Nicholas I. And now the Germans moved in and usurped the control of the papacy. And they deliberately appointed very weak and very immoral popes. Deliberately, because they considered if they were interested in pursuing the lusts of the flesh, they would not be interested in, not able and have no time or energy to build up the power of the papacy. And so they dominated the papacy throughout the 10th century and halfway through the 11th century, until the rise of the great popes that we discussed in our previous study, the four horsemen, Gregory VII, Leo IX, Cardinal Humbert, and Peter Damian. Now, Otto dreamed of uniting the East and West empires, that is, uniting with the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople, and even went so far as to have his son marry the daughter of the Byzantine emperor. He suppressed the nobles, he made successful alliances, he built up the middle class, he built up a civil service, he was able to depose 2 popes and elect 2 other popes, and he collected a number of wonderful scholars in his court, including the great scholar Gerbert of Aurillac, who later became Pope Sylvester II. And we call this the Ottonian Renaissance. In other words, he left a very strong Germany when he died. His son Otto II, who had married the daughter of the Byzantine emperor, was weak. But their son, Otto III, would come along, who would have a grandfather who was a Byzantine emperor and a grandfather who was a German emperor, and the desire here was that this man, who's half Byzantine and half German, would be able to reunite the empires. Gerbert of Aurillac worked with him, but unfortunately both men died within a year of each other about the time of the turn of the millennium. They were followed by another dynasty. The German nobles then elected Conrad II, the Franconian ruler, or Salian ruler as they're sometimes known. And for 100 years, Germany was under the Salians. Conrad II, Henry III, Henry IV, and Henry V. Now these were very capable rulers. And the interesting thing about this history, and it makes it very simple, I think, to tell you, is each of these dynasties rules about 100 years. until we get to the Habsburgs, and then they rule between 1273 and 1918. But these dynasties rule 100 years. Each one is more powerful than the one before. Centralizes power more, which means with every dynasty, with every 100 years, the church has much more of a problem trying to assert its authority, even over itself, even over the church. The German rulers are determined to dominate. Now, the real conflict came with Henry IV. Henry IV followed a very powerful ruler, his father, Henry III, and he continued to appoint bishops in the church. But the date of Henry IV's reign is 1056 to 1106. In 1025, approximately, Hildebrand becomes the power behind the throne, moving out of the Cluny Reform movement, dedicated to reform, dedicated to regaining power for the church, dedicated to this dream of a Christendom. And eventually, this man became the Pope. By 1054, about the time that Henry assumes his power, Gregory was really in control of things, along with the others. And by 1073, he was selected as Pope. Now, he becomes the mortal enemy of the German emperor. Now, how did he manage to be selected Pope? Well, these four men were clever enough to remove the selection process from the German emperor and create the College of Cardinals. And the College of Cardinals would then name the Pope. And with Gregory in as Pope, the great powerful Gregory VII, with his dictation of the Pope that says that only the Pope can depose an emperor, the Pope is the one who selects the bishops, and so forth. Now we're set for a conflict. It began with a series of letters being written back and forth. Gregory writes a letter to the emperor. From now on, you are to cease and desist appointing the bishops. I will appoint the bishops. You do not have the right to do this. This is my instruction to you as my son in the faith. The emperor writes back and says, I do not intend to allow you to appoint the bishops. I will continue to appoint the bishops. The Pope writes and says, if you do not submit to my authority, I will excommunicate you. I will condemn your soul to eternal hell. Unless you repent, you're in danger of eternal damnation. The emperor writes back to Gregory, false pope, impious priest, step down, I say. Step down. You have no right to be pope. You're a disgrace to the office. And in other words, the tone escalates. The bitterness escalates in this war of words. We still have their correspondence, of course. And they're writing back and forth, getting more and more intense all the time. And we can see a head of steam building up, and something is going to blow. Then the Pope decided to act. He excommunicated the emperor. The emperor ignored the excommunication. You have not the right to excommunicate me because you have not the right to be Pope. This whole process of seizing the election procedure is illegal. I should be appointing popes. Therefore, you are not a pope. You're an impostor. So I don't accept your excommunication. Whereupon, Gregory said, we'll see about that. I intend to convene a council of the German nobles. And I intend to propose to the German nobles that they get rid of you, that they depose you. And I will put them under pain of excommunication unless they obey me. This the Pope intended to do, and Henry knew very well that he would do. Now he was between the rock and the hard place, so to speak. If he allowed the Pope to convene that council, he feared that he would be fired as emperor because the German nobility had the power to do that. And right now he knew that he probably couldn't win because they feared the growing power of their emperor more than they feared this pope, this priest. And so if he did nothing, if he was submissive, if he did not in some way try to stop the Holy Father, he was going to lose his job. On the other hand, if he does try to stop the Holy Father, he can be considered guilty of interfering with the Church of God. And so he had a very clever little scheme that he thought up. The Pope had to cross the Alps. He had to go from Italy to Germany. And there's a huge mountain range, a beautiful mountain range called the Alps between the two. And then they didn't have trains and plains. You had to go by foot, and it was an arduous journey over the mountains. And the Pope had to stop at various places, various monasteries along the way to spend the night. And he stopped at a place in 1077 called Canossa. And Henry was waiting for him outside of the monastery in the snow. Up in the mountains it's cold, it's snow. He was wearing the sackcloth of a penitent next to his bare skin. He was barefooted, as a penitent would be, standing in the snow, begging the Pope's pardon and forgiveness, repenting of his sin, asking the Pope to absolve him from sin. Now he put the Pope between the rock and the hard place, because the Pope knew very well that this was a sham, that if he forgave him, that Henry would go right back to appointing bishops. And yet he was a priest. He has an obligation before God that if someone comes in repentance and asks for pardon, he must give that pardon, else he would stand under the curse of God. So for 3 days, the Pope remained inside the monastery at Canossa. And for 3 days, Henry's men tried to keep him warm as he stood in the snow. And finally the Pope yielded and forgave the emperor. And now the Pope had to go home. There's no need to convene the council, because how could he convene a council against a true son of the church who has repented of his sins? And that's just what Henry wanted him to do. And of course, as soon as the Pope goes back to Rome, Henry goes back to appointing the bishops. Now the next time that this conflict arose and the Pope tried to do something, Henry had strengthened his alliances with the nobles. He knew that's what he had to do politically. And so he worked with his nobles to gain their support and gain their confidence. And the next time there was a contest, he knew the nobles stood with him. And when the Pope tried to excommunicate him, tried to act against him, he took his army into Rome, sacked the city of Rome in the year 1084. The Pope was driven out of Rome and died in exile in 1085 in Salerno, Italy. We're talking about the great Gregory VII now. And it looks like Henry won that round, but let me tell you, the battle was not over by any means. Henry died in 1106. Henry V comes along and he rules, and by this time there's some factions arising in the German political system between the Ghibellines, who want to see the empire continued, and the Guelphs, who want to see local lords have more authority. Let me just make a brief comment on this. German people historically were tribally organized. That meant that kings were always elected. That meant that they had a reluctance by nature to have an all-powerful king or emperor. It was more Roman than German to have an emperor. The Ghibellines followed a Roman philosophy and wanted an emperor. The Guelphs wanted to go back to the Germanic elective idea, where the king is just the CEO and the nobles are the board of directors. And so this conflict goes on. And the Ghibellines won. In 1138, after a struggle for several years of civil war, Conrad III, a Hohenstaufen, was elected as emperor, but he came to power on a platform of imperialism. In other words, the Hohenstaufen family said, we're going to turn this into an hereditary monarchy and do away with the elective procedure entirely. And he tried very hard to do this. Now, Conrad had to make compromises with the church in order to do that. But he did strengthen the position of the Hohenstaufen family. And let me tell you this. It is here with the Hohenstaufens that Germany reached its high point. It is here with the Hohenstaufens that we see Germany as the greatest power in Europe, as the greatest power in the world, with a united empire. Now, in later years, that empire collapsed, and Germany divided up once again into many little states. Some people say 300 little German states. This was the condition that we see Germany in the 18th century. And as we come into the 19th century, there was no German state. And Germany unified only, again, only in the year 1870. 1870. And so from 1254, the downfall of the Hohenstaufens, until 1870, there is no single German nation. And it is this desire to recreate a German nation and to go back to that glory that they had in the Middle Ages that inspired the Kaiser in World War I and that inspired Adolf Hitler in World War II. We cannot understand why this happened. this World War I, World War II, unless we have an understanding of what's going on here in medieval Germany. And there's the political aspect of it. I know that's not church history, but that's very important to understand the world we live in. And Germany is, again, united. The question is, have they lost the imperial dream? I won't even begin to answer that. But back to the church part of it. Frederick I came along as the next emperor in 1152, ruled till 1190, ruled nearly half a century, a long time. He was called Barbarossa, the red-bearded one. And he will even change the name of Germany to the Holy Roman Empire in 1155. And that is the name that will be the name of Germany until 1806, the Holy Roman Empire. Why is it holy? Well, Frederick helped the Pope. Adrian IV had been driven out by a usurper, and he helped the Pope get back on his throne. So he said, I did a holy thing. Roman? Well, he came to control Italy. He fought many wars to control Italy. He said, this is Rome's home territory, so he controlled Italy. It's Roman. It's an empire. Many different language groups within his control. Some people have said rather sarcastically it was neither Holy Roman nor an empire. I won't argue on the first 2 points how holy it was or how Roman it was, but I will say it was an empire. And he devoted himself to this. He worked hard at it. When you go through North Italy today, you will find many walls and towers and fortresses built by Frederick I. He will build up his empire in Italy, in Poland, in Bohemia, which is today the Czech Republic, in Austria. He was a capable military leader. He was an intelligent ruler. He was enthusiastic. He was legendary. The kings of Europe acknowledged his supremacy. Unlike his father, he was unwilling to make concessions to the church and began to show his contempt for the church. Once destroyed a picture of his father receiving his crown from the Pope. On another occasion, refused to get off his horse in the presence of the Pope. On still another occasion, he made the Pope apologize for even implying that he was his vassal. He was able to rule independently of the church. He was able to rule independently of the nobles. He led 6 campaigns in Italy. And it was only death that stopped this man. And you see, he went on the Third Crusade, the one with Richard the Lion-Hearted in 1189. And in 1190, as he was crossing a river that was swollen by rain, he was swept off his horse, and you see he was wearing a suit of armor. It's very hard to swim when you're wearing a suit of armor, and he drowned. He never made it to the Holy Land. He was succeeded by his son Henry VI. He reigned only 7 years. Henry continued this imperial dream. He moved his capital to Sicily, to Palermo, Sicily. He had married Constance of Sicily. And there was a strong Byzantine influence in Sicily. And these were Norman rulers. They were very powerful rulers. And Germany reached a very high point, strangely enough, a capital all the way down in Sicily, not in Germany. His dream was to reconquer the Byzantine Empire. His dream was to do what his grandfather had tried to do, and that is to establish an hereditary monarchy. But he died of the plague, he and his wife Constance, in 1197. He was succeeded by his son Frederick II. Stupor Mundi. Matthew of Paris called him Stupor Mundi. That means the wonder of the world. I wish we had the time to talk about Frederick in detail. This man who took a traveling menagerie with him everywhere he went. This man who sent academic questionnaires to his nobles. This man who performed scientific experiments. If you're ever into the history of science, you will study Frederick II and his famous experiments. He was a great scholar. He was a powerful ruler. And he hated the church. Even though he was brought up as a boy because his parents died of the plague by Pope Innocent III, the greatest pope of them all. Maybe he understood the papacy a little too well. But he never came to terms with the church. He really never came to terms with Christ. He was very tolerant, of course, of Jews and heretics and anybody. But he was hardly a devout Christian. And it is here, at this point, that the struggle between the German Empire and the papacy reached its climax. Because the popes who came after Innocent III, Innocent died in 1216, and Frederick had only been emperor for a few years, for 6 years at that point. He comes to power in 1210. By the way, Innocent named him as emperor. Innocent named 2 different emperors, as a matter of fact. He had that power. Innocent came as close as any pope to controlling the world during his reign from 1198 to 1216. But Innocent died. And the popes who followed Innocent III were not as capable, namely Gregory IX and Innocent IV. And these two popes made it their policy, their goal, to destroy this German emperor. And the German Emperor Frederick II, Stupor Mundi, made it his policy to destroy the church and the power of the church. And I liken this to two deer who have locked their antlers in combat. And they are so locked that there's no way they can pull themselves apart. They're going to die as a result of locking their antlers together. You know that situation. And that is precisely what happened to both the German Empire and the papal authority, the papal monarchy. When Frederick died in 1250, the papacy thought it had won. After lying about him and calling councils against him and doing everything, bringing armies against him, everything to stop this man. And he would not be stopped. He died of a fever in 1250. And then the papacy, thinking it had won, gave Sicily, which was the capital of the German Empire, to the French, to Charles of Anjou. But in 1282, the Sicilians rose up and overthrew the French, whom they hated. And as a result, they showed that the Pope was not as powerful as he thought he was, because he couldn't make it stick. He couldn't give Sicily to the French. The Hohenstaufen dynasty died out in 1254. The Habsburgs came in. They were not imperialistically minded, as the Hohenstaufens were. And what happened in Sicily on 1282, when the Sicilians drove out the French, was a barometer that shows that, number one, the German Empire is gone because they can't even control their former capital. Number two, the papal power is gone because they cannot even make it stick that they had made Charles of Anjou the head of Sicily. And the downfall of the papal monarchy came with Boniface VIII, when he didn't realize that the power of the papacy was gone. He reigned between 1294 and 1303. And he tried to force the issue that the kings of Europe could not tax the clergy. They resisted because these were modern-type kings coming along who needed that revenue. And the King of England and the King of France both insisted they had the right to tax the clergy. He was thus alienating two nations that, to some degree, had been supporters of the papacy, especially France. And it was the French king, Philip IV, who sent his representative to meet with the Pope at Anagni in 1303, telling the Pope that the French king refuses to bow to the Pope's authority, that the French king will continue to tax the clergy. The Pope became irate. He was an old man. He was an evil man. He was not a spiritual man at all. The Pope became irate, and the representative of Philip IV, Guillaume Nogaret, slugged the Pope. And the Pope fell to the ground, to the floor, and subsequently died. Whereupon the French cardinals said Rome is no longer safe, and moved the entire capital of the Roman Church to France, to Avignon, France, and we have the Babylonian captivity of the Church for 70 years. The point is, the papacy as a monarchy, as a universal power, as a sovereign power in Europe, is gone. The papacy remained as a spiritual power and the head of the Roman Church, but as far as ruling Europe, it was over. It was history at that point. The papal monarchy and the German Empire were probably defeated more by the rise of nationalism than anything else. But the dream of a Christian world, united as one community, perhaps collapsed because of the sinfulness of the men who proposed to lead it, and their involvement in tactics that were un-Christ-like. But there's still a legacy that comes down to us. And this is the positive side of it, the legacy of a vision of a Christendom, a community, a reign of Christ, a society that revolves around the purposes of God, and that vision does not die.